Maurice Nicole's Psychological Commentary, Volume 2, based on his work with Gurdjieff. Birdlip, March 10th, 1945. Commentary on the difference between the object and the thought of the object. Part 1 of 2. The object is physically rendered to us by the senses. Please understand that what we call physical is rendered by our senses. I see a person, I touch him, and I hear him. And then I call this person a physical object. That is, the senses give a physical object. If you have no eyes, nor ears, nor sense of touch, this so-called physical object will vanish. This is the first point to understand, namely, what we mean by the physical world, which our senses render to us, and which we take as reality. Yet, please note that if you had not the senses, there would be no physical reality. Now, a question was recently asked in connection with the following quotation from a paper. This Sufi teacher wants to point out that whether a person takes pleasure in disliking the thing itself or in the thought of it, it is the same thing, and vice versa. The question was about understanding the difference between disliking the object and disliking the thought of it, and no difference could be understood. I will remind you here of something said in this connection a long time ago. You're eating something, let us say, with great relish and enjoying it as a physical object. And then you are told it is a stew of snails, and instantly you feel very sick. Here, obviously, the thought is different from the physical sensation. Now, our thinking is different from our senses, and on another plane, another level. You can see a person, or you can think about him. How you think about him is psychological and belongs to your inner psychological world. And you can go on thinking about this person you dislike quite apart from seeing him. When the Sufi teacher says that taking pleasure in disliking a thing and taking pleasure in the thought of it is the same thing, he means just what he says. I would ask you, first of all, do you know an example of taking pleasure in disliking some object or person? Remember that a person is an object, and remember that the work teaches a great deal about how we take pleasure in disliking things. The question is subtle because we always imagine we do not take pleasure in disliking people, and for this reason, it is necessary to find for yourself some real example of your disliking some physical object or person. You know that if you dislike a person that is an object, it gives you great pleasure to hear that someone else dislikes it in the same way. This is pleasure in disliking, and the pleasure is reinforced by the agreement of others with you. Is not this a common thing if you are frank with yourselves? But the pleasure of disliking somebody or something is not the same as the pleasure you take in thinking about it. When a person looking at another person as an object transmitted through the senses says, "Oh, how I hate a man like that," he takes pleasure in disliking the object when it is before his eyes. And afterwards, if he thinks about this person, when he can no longer see him with his senses, he takes pleasure in thinking how he dislikes him. Then it is, as the Sufi teacher says, exactly the same thing. He is taking pleasure in disliking the object when he sees it, and taking pleasure in thinking about the object when he does not see it. And so the effect is just the same. In one case, he is taking impressions of dislike from the visible object, and in the other, he is taking impressions from the thought of it. So in both cases, he is taking in negative impressions, and psychologically, it is the same thing in its effects on him. If a man wants to overcome his displeasure in disliking a person, he must also overcome his pleasure in thinking how he dislikes that person. The work teaches that we must learn to handle one another rightly in the domain of our thoughts, that is, in our psychological world, to which we have gradually to become more responsible. It is the reordering, the rearrangement of our psychological or inner life, and that is the object of this work. It is how we think about others that is so important in this work. If you take great pleasure in thinking evil of others, in thinking negatively, and attain a feeling of satisfaction from it, then your psychological world, from which starts the function of second and third bodies, is in a great mess. And you may crystallize out psychologically in a quite wrong way. A man may for a long time not be able to overcome momentary dislike through the senses, but if he is working, he knows quite well how he will have to get rid of thinking and feeling the same way internally. That is, he must realize that he cannot take pleasure in unpleasant thoughts about others, which is the greatest source of our inner life as it is. If our psychological world of thought and feeling could be got into better order, that is, the way in which we think and feel about people in our privacy, and if we could cease to take pleasure in hatred and negative criticism in general, our external relationship to one another as physical objects registered by our senses would alter completely. There are external reactions and more internal reactions. For a long time, we may react mechanically, that is, we may react externally and cannot change this. But if we have any insight, that is, self observation, we will not necessarily in our internal side agree with our external side unless we see that we have an internal life of thought and feeling to which this work is directed with the object of building up a psychological body or organization rightly arranged. Then we do not understand what the work is about. The object of self-observation is to let a ray of light into our inner world, which is in chaos. The object of this work is to build this inner world of chaos into an ordered world. An ordinary man behaves internally just as he pleases. He may be very polite externally. It does not occur to him how he thinks and feels privately about other people matters. But the work says it does matter, and so it begins with self-observation, whose object is to make us more conscious of what is going on in ourselves in each center. After a time, you may reach the stage where you behave much better inside than you do outside. You cannot change the external until the internal is changed. For example, I cannot expect to change some negative reaction unless I see internally what lies, what wrong thoughts and feelings are produced in me. Then I may wish to change my inner state because through inner taste, I dislike what is going on in me.